Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast. Yes, my voice is back. I'm back from holiday, and that's very exciting. I was in India and France, and very exciting times. Ate a lot of food, as you'd expect from both those places, so that was epic. We've got some people who are currently traveling. So, Danette and Graham, you're sharing a screen today. I might start with you, Danette. Where are you recording from?
We are in Melbourne recording from the Ritz-Carlton, which is pretty awesome. It's beautiful here. We're at an event, so we've ducked out to do the podcast. Very excited.
Well, thank you for your commitment to the podcast. Very exciting, and I'm glad that we've finally committed to recording at least some of our podcasts from the Ritz-Carlton. You know, it's been a goal, I think, but I'm glad we finally got there. Graham, you're on the podcast. How are you going this week?
I'm good, Jess. Thanks. Missed out on the opportunity to say that we're also coming to you from another country because there's no Ritz-Carlton hotel in West Wyalong. So maybe next time. Who knows?
We've got to hit every Ritz. We've got to record a Magical Learning Podcast from every Ritz. We've always said it's our goal, and we'll finally get there. West Wyalong, let's get those business plans happening. And returning guest, our most returning guest across the Magical Learning Podcast and Adapt Podcast, Colin Elis. How are you going this week?
Really good, Jez. Thank you. Maybe next time I can be in the original Ritz in the UK when we record it. I'm just feeling left out, you know, because I'm in a room with a green screen. It just doesn't feel right that I'm not at the Ritz. Yeah.
That sounds absolutely great. Colin, I think if you can organise that, I feel like we'd really be sort of avoiding any potential of a toxic work culture, which we'll get into very shortly. And that's what you're here to talk about today. People would have seen the title of the podcast. But this is to do with your new book, Detox Your Culture, which... if we will get the people to look on the screen, if you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify, you can see we've got a copy here at the Ritz-Carlton. So, Colin, before we get into today's conversation, do you want to tell us a little bit about that book?
So I wrote it, Jez, as a reaction to the number of toxic culture stories in the media. Just after 2019, I'd published Culture Fix, which I've talked about on the show before, which really sets out kind of how to build a culture. But I noticed that the media were taking more and more interest into toxic cultures. And I think there's this sense that, well, it's inevitable. It's just going to happen at some stage. And I really wanted to write the book to not only bring to life some of the case studies around toxic culture, but also what organizations, managers, employees can do to actually avoid falling into the same trap. Because every time you read a toxic culture story, you're like, I feel like I've read this somewhere before, and it's largely the same mistakes over again. So I just wanted to, again, as part of my, and this is kind of when I think about all the culture books that I've written, it was the one gap. It was like, okay, well, how do we, because culture's the, like the number one determinant of success, is how do we make sure it doesn't go bad?
Great. Well, I'm so glad we've got you on to chat about this book. And actually, the topic is not exactly detox your culture, but we're actually talking specifically about how do organizations avoid a toxic work culture. So I guess before we jump into the questions, and Danette's got some good questions to really lay out what this topic is sort of about. But just briefly, Colin, why did you choose this topic?
So I'd read a particular story about a toxic culture in the UK, Jez, that was pretty horrific. And I have to say that writing the book was a pretty dispiriting exercise. Like, normally I absolutely love writing, but some of the case studies that I read were absolutely horrific. So I'll share with you the particular case study that really prompted me to write the book was around the Metropolitan Police in London, who've had a toxic culture, it feels like, for about 12 years. And so some of the things that came out of that were pretty horrific. And I just thought, someone's got to write about this. Somebody's got to kind of point out where these organizations go wrong, but someone's got to provide leaders, managers with a bit of a blueprint to say, hey, listen, if you follow this blueprint, you'll never have to be in the position that the Met Police, the leaders, and the people on the receiving end of the toxic culture. So that was the first one. The other one was somebody had committed suicide, at an organization in Australia, and that was and it was all work stress related. So that was my real motivation for writing it.
Well, what a great conversation. And I think that speaking of just, how these things can affect people's mental health, as you were touching on at the end there, it's such an important conversation that's happening more and more. So I think, without further ado, I think we've got to dive into it. Thanks for teeing that up, Colin. I'll start with Danette here. Danette, you've got, as always, 2 questions. So lay them on us and tell us why you chose them.
So I'll start with the first one. And I just reckon some people will just ask, what makes a toxic culture? So I just figured we'd start with that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So toxic cultures arise when senior leaders permit employees to behave or perform poorly over a period of time. Toxic cultures are never, ever a surprise. You might have one particular individual that behaves unethically. So a great example of that would be Nick Leeson of Barings Bank, which is about 15, 20 years ago now. And that was one person that behaved unethically for his own goal. But the culture wasn't toxic, just that one person was. Whereas cultures being toxic is where senior leaders walk past or choose not to address poor behaviours from others or poor performance from others. So that's the real definition of toxic.
And so then my question actually comes to the bit about leaders. So what roles do leaders play in actually creating culture, whether it's positive or toxic?
Yeah, so leaders have a responsibility. In fact, what the research says is that 76% of employees actually see leaders as being responsible for culture. And yet the reality is different than that, in the sense that everybody has a role to play in culture. Every employee, doesn't matter whether you've been there 5 minutes or 50 years, leaders have got a responsibility to invest in culture and then continually invest in it after that. I was speaking to an organization just yesterday, the CEO of an organization yesterday, who wants to do it in the right way. And he said, so what does the program look like? I was like, well, it's not really a program. It's a continual investment. I was like, we'll do a piece of work at the start to really establish the foundations. We'll teach your managers how to build it, but then it's up to you to continually invest and measure and make sure you get the return on your investment. But ultimately, Danette, leaders have got a responsibility to make sure that nobody bullies anybody, nobody harasses anybody, that there's no racism, that there's no sexism, that there's no misogynism, there's no ageism. Organizational cultures are inclusive. There's no verbal or emotional abuse. There's no unwanted physical contact. All of these things contribute to turning a culture toxic. And so leaders have got a responsibility to not only understand culture, not only make sure that they make money and time available to build and define culture, but then to take decisive action when they see individuals trying to undermine what's been built and creating unsafe working conditions for the rest of the employees.
So I've actually got another question now, because it's actually raised something in me, particularly because what I see in a lot of organisations is leaders will get excited about something at the start, but that whole continual commitment, I suspect, is something that a lot of organisations potentially have challenge with, because there's more shiny new things that they might want to focus on. So how do we make sure that leaders keep that continual commitment to it?
So it comes back to the fundamental point, Danette, that if leaders understand the importance of culture, continual investment is easy. And it's very easy for a culture expert to say that. But it's the culture that you choose to build, right? And you get the culture that you choose to build. The culture that you choose to build is responsible for the results that you get. So if you don't choose to build the culture, then you're going to have mediocre results. If you actually put time, thought, and effort into building a culture and give managers agency over how do we build it in line with values, it's the foundation for all results. All results. If you want an organization that's high performing, if you want an organization hits deadlines, if you want an organization that hits targets, you have to put time, thought, effort, and money into building the culture, because the culture is the machine that pumps out the results. The leaders that understand that, Danette, are then like, right, so we need to keep the machine well-oiled. And well-oiled is every time we redefine the strategy, usually every 3 years, we need to redefine the culture because the culture needs to change to deliver the strategy. We need to make sure that new managers have the skills to be able to build vibrant culture and they understand the kind of person that they need to be in 2024 and beyond. And we need to bring the organization together socially such that we're creating these bonds, we're creating empathy, we're creating camaraderie, the outputs of which are collaboration, good behavior, the outputs of which are results. So I think it comes back to that point, is when leaders understand the importance of culture, it makes the evolution and the investment in it really, really easy.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer. Thanks, Colin.
Yeah, thanks for that. Great questions there, Danette. Now I'm going to throw over to Graham. So, Graham, what was your question, and tell us a bit about why you chose it?
I've been unduly influenced by Danette, so I've actually ended up with 2 questions, Colin. I do apologise, but it's
Fine, Graham.
It's part of the culture. We're here at the Ritz-Carlton in Melbourne. How many plugs do we have to give them before we get free dinner?
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly right. I'm just thinking that as well. Oh, welcome to a night's stay. Oh, great. We'll keep talking about the Ritz.
So my questions were firstly around, so in your experience, who typically does choose what constitutes toxic behaviour? Because when we talk about toxic culture, I mean, we're really talking about unacceptable behaviour. There's been a tendency to label people as toxic and, well, I can't work with that person because he or she's toxic. And it's typically not the person at all, it's just their behaviour for whatever reason. So I guess the first part of the question was who typically gets to decide that behaviour is toxic or unacceptable? And then based on that, so is it the leaders that are setting the bar in the context of acceptable behaviour, or does it often come from people lower down? And depending on that, how, in your experience, how does that then impact how quickly that sort of behaviour is addressed? So if it's a leader identifying it, do things happen much faster than they often do if it's somebody on the front line who is naming the behaviour? Did that sort of make sense? Because
it makes perfect sense.
And then towards the end, I think it started sounding like Latin.
No, I got it. One of the things I talk about in the book, Graham, is just because somebody says a culture's toxic doesn't necessarily make it toxic. One of the case studies I used was there's a TV show in the UK called This Morning, and one of the presenters was labelled as a toxic individual. Basically, he had an affair with a member of staff. It was all very above board. He just kept it secret and he'd lied to a few people, and people were very understandably very hurt and very put out. And then a couple of people said, oh, the culture's toxic. And it wasn't. But they did an investigation, which is what you should always do, to establish that it wasn't. So who decides is it's kind of up for debate, really, in the sense that I might think it's what's toxic for me, you might find really motivating. And so it's important that we're really, really clear on what constitutes toxic behavior. And you're absolutely right. It's largely behavioral. A culture can also be can be toxic if it's too nice. I know that sounds a bit crazy, but you just don't get any work done over a period of time. And you kill each other with the niceness, and then all of a sudden it turns nasty. But different employees can feel different things at different times. And what you want is to create an environment where it's okay for them to raise their concerns, to give them a sounding board. And so this is generally where people and culture departments come in. Although one of the things I found doing the research is often they're not that flash, or they fear for their own jobs by actually giving oxygen to some of these allegations, which is why, a lot of organizations, bigger organizations have kind of whistleblowing avenues that people can go down now that are anonymous. Fundamentally, though, it's leaders that set the tone for the culture. So you're looking, I worked with a leadership team recently, and it's like, you've got to change your behavior so it's fit for 2024, 25, 26 and beyond. The world is changing rapidly. Not just technology. Obviously, there's a lot of divisiveness around politics. There's a lot of global conflicts, so leaders have to be educated, but they also have to be the kind of people that other people can look up to and say they're the role models for culture. And then depending how quickly it's addressed will depend whether it gets better or worse. So the genesis for a toxic culture is what I would call a combatant culture. Now, combatant cultures, we've all worked in combatant cultures. Everything's a fight. Everything's a bit of a battle. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of stress. But the behavior isn't that bad. Listen, it's not great because it just feels like this. And we use words like, oh, we're butting heads and stuff like that. That's not great. But if you stay there too long, then it becomes corrosive. And corrosive is when you get shouting, aggressive profanities. It's when you get like malicious gossip. And at that point, it starts to turn. But at that stage, you've got a choice. So if leaders stamp on that quickly, recognize they need to do something different, then you can flip out of the toxic culture back to combatant, to vibrant. The next stage, though, is harmful. And so that's, physical, verbal abuse, emotional cruelty, fraud, all of this kind of stuff, lies, cover-ups, all that stuff. And at that point, it's almost impossible to come back from without removing a layer of senior leaders. Just very, very quick, I've been talking a long time here. So a great example I saw myself in action, and this is my last job in the UK in 2007, is somebody punched somebody in the face in the office. Tension had been building for a while, so it'd been combatant. These two guys just didn't get on. So this guy punched this other guy in the face, right? And you never forget the sound of that in the office. It's terrible. It's an awful thing to happen. He was put on gardening leave immediately. He was marched out of the office immediately by his manager. He was put on gardening leave. He was fired the next day. And that's how you deal with that kind of behavior. Had they just let that drift, which most organizations do, had it just let it drift, then it just would have infected the culture for years to come.
Sorry, we're just having, Colin, thank you so much for your response. Very detailed, really appreciate it. We're just having some challenges in managing the mute, unmute. One taps unmute, the other one taps almost immediately at the same time and remutes. It's a cultural thing that we're working on. I was almost going to ask whether the example you shared right at the end about somebody punching a colleague at work may have actually involved certain British television presenters in a particular motor sport field, for argument's sake. But I didn't want to ask that question.
That one particularly didn't, but that can arise. The important thing, the important point there is that it was just dealt with immediately. But like I said, toxic culture is never a surprise. Those guys hated each other, and everybody knew it. But nothing was ever done to bring them closer together. One of the things I say all of the time is you don't go to work to make friends. If you make friends, it's a byproduct of the culture, and it's a really good thing. But what you do is you go there to respect each other, to get the job done, so you can come home with money in your pocket to do the things that you want to do with the people that you enjoy doing them with. And you can't allow any individual to undermine the environment for everybody else.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that, Colin. And I think speaking of upset employees, I'm going to jump over to my question now, which is we've all worked with other employees who can be a bit of a Debbie Downer, even if the boss themselves is upbeat. It can sometimes lead to a bit of a grey cloud in the business, in my opinion. What can leaders do to address this?
So what they fail to do time and time again, Jez, is to actually define the culture up front. And by that, I mean, let's connect people as human beings. Let's generate some empathy. This is who I am. This is how I like to be communicated to. These are my preferences, and so on and so forth. You generate that understanding. That's not to say that everybody gets conditions just for them. That's selfishness. We don't really want that. But there's that connection. Then we agree, how will we behave? Now, I gave the point the other day at a workshop where engineers, when they work together, might work completely differently than bankers when they work together, or a sports team when they work together. And this is why it's really important that people understand that you can't have a monoculture within an organization. You can't say at the top, this is our culture, everybody does the same things. And so one of the things that leaders can do is to really set the vision, set the values, but then train their managers on how to build culture within their own team. And when you do that, what it does is it generates agency, Jez. And it generates a sense of belonging. Also, what it should do is spark intrinsic motivation. Funny you mentioned Debbie Downer. For those of you who don't know, Debbie Downer is a skit from Saturday Night Live in the 1990s, and it's Rachel Dratch is the comedian that plays it. It's absolutely brilliant, and I often play it at culture workshops to demonstrate how one person can take the wind out of everybody's sails. But if you give people agency over their culture, it generates intrinsic motivation, and people care. They're like, this is our culture. We want to make sure that we can uphold it. It's our responsibility. But when you do get one Debbie Downer, it's the team that holds that individual to account. I just want to make the point as well that Debbie Downer can be any gender. It's not just because it's the name Debbie. It can be any gender of person. But it's the team that holds them to account when the team have been involved in actually defining the culture. One of my proudest moments as a manager was when I found out about something that happened within my team, probably about 4 weeks after it happened. I found out quite by chance. And I said to my assistant, I was like, what happened? She was like, you don't need to know. All you need to know is it got sorted out. I'm like, this is great. It's really great when that happens. So I think that leaders, what they can do to address it is firstly to be empathetic. Is everything okay? What can I do to help? Leaders' principal job is to inspire and motivate. That's their job. And I think that often gets lost, mainly because we hire people based on technical expertise rather than people leadership skills. And then when we do hire, when we do give them those jobs, we don't then teach them how to be managers. So leaders, they role model, they set the tone, but also they're responsible for generating intrinsic motivation, or at least instilling it into the team.
Well, yeah, thanks you for sharing that, Colin, and I'm glad we could share a love of the 1990s SNL skit, Debbie Downer.
So good, yeah.
I'll link that in the description, so if people want to watch that, you can check that out, yeah. Well, let's mix it up a little bit. Let's go over to Mark's question here, which is, what are some tools that a workplace or company can use to have a culture refresh?
Very few organizations actually need cultural transformation. I hear this a lot. You generally need cultural transformation when your strategy is quite different from the one you had previously, or you've got a toxic culture, in which case you need to do a complete transformation, which means removing the people that presided over the toxic culture as well. A refresh is something that organizations should do pretty much every year, or at least every strategy cycle. And so they should be looking at the core values. So without turning this into an MBA course, the first thing that leaders do is set a vision. Off the back of the vision, they set a strategy. The strategy informs the goals. They come up with an operating model to deliver the goals. And then it's about defining the culture to deliver those goals, right? And so every year there should be a refresh. This is often when people aren't where they need to be in terms of targets. They'll bring the team together, they'll have a bit of an offsite, and then they waste that opportunity by not refreshing the culture. And so that involves having a look at your values. Are they still fit for purpose? Acknowledging everything that you do well right now. And I mean in terms of how do we behave that's good? How do we work together and collaborate that's good? And it has to be good for the team, not just for the individual. And how are we making time for creative thinking? Those are the kind of things we want to capture. And then on the flip side of that, what do we need to improve? And the thing is when you do that kind of refresh, there has to be immediate accountability. Too many of these offsites refreshes, they're quite gimmicky. It's like there's a theme, or, we're going to do this. And it's kind of not wrong, but it is if it doesn't contain any accountability. And whilst it's good to mix as a team, it's even better if you can mix as a team and then immediately do some things differently. So it really needs to center around, what's the team vision? Is it aspirational enough? Do the values still hold true? Are they emotional principles that we feel that we can practice? How do we leverage what we do well right now? And what are we going to do differently in terms of how we behave, how we collaborate, how we innovate to give us a different outcome following the refresh workshop?
Yeah, very great insights here, Colin. So good to chat to you again and really refresh what culture means and how it ties into everything. I think it's so interesting. Let's jump into Allegra's question here, which is, I would like to hear a couple of examples of really bad culture. What have you seen in terms of bad culture?
God, where do I start? Let's start with a couple of Aussie examples for the benefit of the legal angle. Some of these are allegations. I just want to make that point. There have been toxic culture allegations surround. It's very important that you use that word when you're writing a book on toxic culture. There have been toxic culture allegations around Country Road Retail Group in Australia. Nine News was in the news recently. One employee called it Punishment Island. I mean, that's the very definition of a toxic culture. However, in the case of Nine News, it's not an allegation; it was fact, because they actually publicised the report, which I think is part of the cleansing process when you have a toxic culture. Also, what you have to acknowledge is that organisations in that situation, employees, there's a lot of kind of trauma that needs to be cultural trauma that needs to be processed. So Nine News. Harrods in the UK is playing out at the minute. They had an owner, Mohammed Al Fayed. There have been hundreds of allegations around the way that he treated people, women specifically. Wise Tech in Australia, that was another one recently. Their shares dropped by 25%. So, one of the points that I make in the book is, if you have a toxic culture, it can dramatically affect results, reputation. I still don't think people take that seriously. Wise Tech's a great example. As soon as the toxic culture allegations came to light, shares fell 25%, and that equates to about $4 billion being wiped off the company's value. The worst ones that I've read are definitely Boeing, because Boeing's culture led to a shortcut of critical safety processes, killing hundreds of people, because they knew there were faults with the aircrafts. They've just laid off 17,000 staff as a result, and they may not recover. Confederation of British Industry, they may not recover from their toxic culture. The UK Post Office is playing out in the public arena the way they've treated their postmasters. The Grenfell Tower in the UK, which caught fire, killing innocent people. So all of these things have disastrous consequences, Jez, and it only takes one match to burn a forest. And I think that leaders have really got to get wise to this. This is why I articulate so many case studies in the book. I don't want leaders to make the same mistakes as others have made. Because, as I said, the consequences are catastrophic, not only in terms of physical and mental health of staff, but also in reputation and result.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Also, Graham, did you want to say something before?
Almost certainly, but it's probably almost certain that it wasn't really useful. I think I was going to suggest, when Colin was saying that he wanted to share a couple of Australian examples, I got a little concerned and thought, Colin, can you just not mention any company names that might randomly rhyme with tragical yearning, just in case. But
also, feel free to bleep out any of your own clients in there as well. Who did he mention then? Yeah,
yeah, we'll have the unredacted version available for $10.99.
Right. Where Colin purges himself. Yeah.
No, it's so interesting, Colin. It's so interesting how this, if you don't catch the culture, it's just going to catch up with you at some point. I think of it almost in some ways of like when I'm too lazy to do the dishes or fold my clothes even. That's going to catch up to me when I need those clothes and I'm late. That's the time that I'll have to deal with it. So I can see how it's all things that begin small and then can become quite big. Very fascinating. I wanted to jump into our last question today, which is from Kanika. And Kanika's asked, with all your experience, what are personal red flags that you have noticed are signs someone is likely to be toxic in the workplace? These can be subtle and may even seem unrelated to toxicity, but maybe you've noticed some trends.
Yeah, definitely some trends. So when I look back on my own career, and I was an employee for almost 30 years, I only really worked in what I would consider to be a toxic culture. Some of the signs they're small sometimes. When somebody promises something and then they do something completely different. The toxic culture that I worked in is my boss would irrationally lose control of his emotions. And he would just go into shouting and screaming mode. And that just wasn't who he was. And then he tried to bully his team, of which I was one of them. I was relatively senior. So I was a senior director in the business. Obviously, I'm having none of that. No one's bullying me. But my response to him was, what's going on? This is not who you are. Are you okay? So it's the simple things sometimes, Jez. So it's micromanagement. It's excessive workload. It's not enough time. It's poor work-life balance. So the expectation that you're on all of the time. It's a lack of equity. So you and I do the same job, but you're paid more than I am. It's exclusion. It's avoidance of accountability. It's unrealistic targets. It's unclear expectations. It for me, sometimes it's the simple thing. Malicious gossip is a great one example, because everybody does it. Everybody does it, and all you're doing there, and the way the metaphor that I use, it's like banging two rocks together by a, kind of dry leaves. Sooner or later, when you bang those rocks together, it's going to create a spark that's going to burn those leaves. And I don't think enough people think about that when they're talking behind the backs of others. It's one of the worst things you can do. It's just demonstrates a real lack of courage. So for me, there's some real simple examples, and for me, like I said, they're the sparks. They're the sparks for bullying, harassment, unsafe working conditions, all of those kinds of things. The other one I wanted to mention, lack of trust, is where people just don't trust you to do your job. I observed this at a football match at the weekend where the manager was shouting at the players the whole game. I'm like, that is not a great culture. If the manager's shouting at them the home game, just let them do their jobs. Either you haven't set them up properly, or you just don't trust them to do a good job.
That's why I save all my shouting at sports players for at home, so that they're protected by the TV. All right, well, Colin, that's all our questions today, but I want to grab some final thoughts from everybody. So I might start with Graham. Graham, any final thoughts on today's conversation and how organisations avoid a toxic work culture?
So many. Colin, it's been brilliant. Really appreciate your time. Lots of notes. I like the one of the comments you made early on, and there's a principle or a saying that I've heard somewhere before, but it's the idea that, particularly for leaders or managers and organisations, that the behaviour you ignore is the behaviour that you condone. So it's we bad things happen, good people do nothing, that sort of thing. Actually, I don't know whether you have copyright on this, Jez, or whether we can negotiate a fee for this, but I really like the one, not the folding clothes part, because that's like, what? Is that a thing? But the idea that if you don't catch the culture will catch up with you at some point. I really like that. And the other comment that you made, Colin, was I think around you get the culture that you choose, which I thought was really important in the context of, and this again comes back to the choice. Whilst leaders, owners in an organisation might have more sort of authority or power to make things happen, everybody still has an opportunity to contribute to conversations about what's acceptable and what's not.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Graham, and thanks for your questions today. Always good to have you on. Danette, I'm going to go to you. Any final thoughts on today's conversation and avoiding toxic work cultures? So
fabulous conversation. I love the thing about the cost. So I think, a lot of leaders get really focused on results. And when they start to think about, well, what is the cost if it impacts our reputation, our results, people's physical and mental health and things like that, I think that's really important. And I really liked your point around the refreshing of culture. So if we're updating our strategies, that we also then need to think about, does the old culture work with where we're headed next? And but it is leaders' responsibility to sort of role model and that, but each of us has a role no matter where we are in creating those beautiful cultures. So a fabulous conversation. Loving the book, just holding up the video. Definitely encourage every organisation, in fact every individual should read this book.
Fantastic. And thank you so much, Jeanette, for your questions as well and insights. And I just wanted to say, for me, a big takeaway was just two words. One was respect. And it just seems like you have enough of that going around. It seems like it is pretty good. And empathy as well for people that are struggling. So I think that those are some really good takeaways there. Colin, did you have any final thoughts on this topic before we end?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the point, and Graham alluded to it there, is you do get the culture that you choose to build. I'd love to confidently say, Jez, that we're starting to see a real shift now with leaders starting to think about culture. Honestly, I don't really see it, which is why we continue to see these stories in the media time and time again. Toxic culture doesn't have to be inevitable. Leaders need to invest the time, money, effort into building the kind of culture that not only respects the humans that work for it, but it will also generate the results that they're looking for and maintain their reputation such that they become a magnet for other employees who can help them to maintain their position in whatever market they choose to be in. So yeah, that was just my final thought.
Fantastic. Well, like I said, Colin, it's always good to have you on. This is the fourth time you're on a Magical Learning or Adapt podcast, so it's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
That's all right. Now,
is that like a platinum membership? Like, do I get like special? Is there a lounge that I can go? It's the Ritz-Carlton, isn't it? It's a Ritz-Carlton night at the Ritz.
Yeah, you get to have two of our hosts record from the Ritz. That's your
right.
benefit
Okay,
there.
yeah. It doesn't sound like much of a perk for me, but as long as they're happy, that's the main thing.
Next one we do, you're in the London one, Colin.
Done. Yeah.
Colin, it's been great to have you. I wanted to see if there was any place that people wanted to reach out to you. Where's the best places for them to do that? And where's the best place for them to pick up Detox Your Culture, your new book?
Detox Your Culture is available on Amazon. It's released on December the 4th in Australia. People can find me on LinkedIn. They can find me at my website, colindelis.com. However, one thing that we did do, Jess, is that I worked with the University of Georgia in the US to actually create a culture quiz to give people a sense of where they're at right now. It also produces a report with a list of things that they can do to actually change their culture. And they can find that at 5culturesquiz.com.
Fantastic. Well, next time, hopefully we'll all be in the Ritz and we can enjoy the great culture there. Jeanette and Graham, thank you so much for being great on this podcast. Always good to see you. Colin, thank you again. We'll have to have you on another time so you can continue your hot streak of being our most recorded guest. And to all the people that have been listening and sharing, our YouTube has been doing really well, so go check it out over there. And as always, everybody, have a magical week.